Today I'm going to be talking about burning prairie, which is an important management option because prairie is a very fire dependent ecosystem, and if you don't burn or manage the prairie regularly, then the grass species will gradually take over the ecosystem and the wildflower species will start to diminish. In nature, the way the ecosystem works is a fire comes through, it wipes out all the trees and shrubs, and then over time gradually it succeeds. You know, you get your raspberries and your sumac, they're primary woody species that come in and they'll start establishing and changing the ecosystem, but gradually over time it's going to succeed back to forest. So if you didn't burn in this ecosystem, then you would continuously change back into a forest ecosystem. So in the tallgrass prairie areas, that's what would happen. Indigenous peoples would burn the area to allow more wildlife to come in, create more green vegetation, and so it would burn and the forest would succeed back. And then over time, the forest would slowly creep back in, and then again there would be another burn, and the forest would move back again. So it was this constant dynamic. And so if you leave a prairie alone, you leave a meadow alone, it will eventually turn back into a woodland. Other options include scarifying the soil by lightly disking or running a harrow over it to pull the biomass off, using a harvester to hay the field. So just something that needs to be done to remove the biomass, and then after that you notice that there's a huge flush. The wildflowers come out and the grasses are all nice and healthy. It stimulates them. It actually makes them produce more rhizomes, and they spread out, and then they bind more closely together. So it creates a much healthier ecosystem. So the first thing you need to consider is creating your burn plan. So you have an area that you want to burn. It's tallgrass prairie, or it's meadow, or sometimes I even burn wet meadow when the shrubs are coming in. It's an adaptive management practice. And so you need to delineate your area, and then you need to create your burn plan. So it's like, okay, what do I need to have? The equipment, the people, the manpower. I need enough people to manage the fire, and just in case it gets out of control, you need to have enough people to manage that as well. You need to talk to your fire department and create a blueprint so that they know where they can access into there, where the emergency equipment can access, where's the water source. If you're in the country, they need a water source, so in case the fire gets out of control. Different things like that, and you need to show where your burn barrier is, different aspects that you need to put into your burn plan. So when you start to prepare your field, you want to make sure that it has adequate burn barriers around the property. So what I was doing is I was disking or harrowing a burn barrier about 8 to 10 feet wide, and so that allows you're taking it right back down to the soil so that the fire cannot cross that. You also want to take into consideration, alerting. When you do a burn, you want to alert the fire department before and after the burn happens. You also want to talk to your neighbors so that they're not calling the fire department and causing problems, so that they know exactly what's going to be happening. So what you have your burn barrier around the edge, you have enough people to suppress the fire, you have the right equipment, you have things like backpack sprayers for just a pesticide sprayer full of water. You have all your equipment for fire suppression. You've got, we create a whacker, I call it. It's basically a stick with a piece of rubber tubing at the end that you can whack and knock the fire down. We've got rakes for moving the fire around and for raking the fire back into the fire burn area. So you have all this equipment and you have enough people. You want at least 5 people that are working together. One person will be the burn initiator, and the other people will be working the edges of the property to make sure that the fire doesn't expand out of there. So if you haven't done this before, you probably want to get a professional involved or somebody who's actually done this before, because it is a little bit more complicated. You can, if you're burning around buildings or if you're burning around forests, the wind can change direction. So you want a low, consistent wind speed that's always burning in one direction, that's not shifting around, so that making the burn much more complex. So when you're starting the burn, you're looking for the wind direction coming across low and consistent. And then you choose a point on the far side, so you're burning against the wind. And so you have that one ignition point in the middle of the field. And then slowly you're burning back and forth. So one crew of multiple people goes one direction, one crew goes the other direction. And so this is slowly burning across the back end of the field. And once you get to the full back end burnt, you burn it another probably 10 feet. So you've got your burn barrier of 8 to 10 feet, and then you burn an extra 8 to 10 feet or more, depending how comfortable you are. And then you start burning the sides. And you slowly burn the sides because you have to be careful. Sometimes the wind can change direction. And then once you get out to a certain point, then you start moving across the field. So once you get to a certain point, you've got your burn barrier, and then you've got another area. So you have a large area here that's well burnt, so you don't have to worry so much about the fire jumping. And then you have people on the sides that are moving that burn barrier along. And once that burn barrier on the side, on both sides, is burnt, so you have a bit of a buffer there so it can't jump over very easily, then someone will run along with the fire and move across the field, and then that will work with the wind, and it'll burn quickly across the field. The back burn, which is against the wind, is a slow burn. It's easily manageable, so it's slowly moving and creeping across the field. But once you work with the wind, it's very rapid, and it'll just whip across the field. You can see that here. Here's the fire moving across the field in the back burn back here, and it's slowly, and the wind's blowing this direction. You can see the smoke, and it's slowly creeping towards the front. And then this person is moving across the field, igniting the whole field in strips. And you can see that that's a much bigger flame coming up. So it moves very quickly and just whooshes across that. And that usually the initial burn is the one that's the most tricky. And then after that, we can repeat that. So once you've burned one strip, usually you start out with smaller strips at the beginning because you don't want it to jump past your fire barrier, and what you don't want the strong motion of the fire going with the wind to jump over your burn barrier. So you're starting with smaller sections, and as you gradually move across the field doing strip by strip, you can do a little bit larger and larger. So you can see you've got a large blackened section, so gradually you can move further and further away. You're sure that this side is not going to jump over because you have such a large area. So gradually you're taking off strip by strip by strip, and gradually you're burning the entire field. One of the things that happens when you're doing a burn, and how we control the fire and make it more manageable, is when you're blowing with the wind, you have your back burn and it's slowly coming across the field, and then you create your forward burn with the wind, and those two start to come together. And actually it creates a vacuum in between the two, and the back burn starts to flip towards the fire that's coming, the fast moving fire, and it actually creates a vacuum and sucks the two together very quickly. So the burn happens very quickly, and it's much more controlled once it starts doing that sucking motion, because it's pulling everything into the center. So on the edges and in different parts of the prairie, if you're finding that you need to control the fire, you can use that kind of sucking motion to bring the fire in, to move it around in different directions. So this is just showing you the final burn. So you burn basically the whole field, and then you do your last burn and you basically sweep it across the field really quickly. So you shouldn't have as much problem with burn barriers and that sort of thing. You still have to watch the edges. You still have to watch because you can have creeping fire across the burn barriers. So you just have to be really careful and always vigilant, always mindful, and always have good communication between the two sides of the burn. There can be problems if people start moving too quickly. They get ahead of the person running across the field, so you just have to have good communication between the two groups. This is an example of what happens when you don't have good communication. This fire we were burning, it was a little bit more complex. There was these two mounds, and so when the guy went around the backside to burn the burn barrier, he went a little bit too far ahead, and so that between the mounds created a bit of a wind tunnel, and it just whipped right through there. When I took this picture, and I quickly had to jump over the ditch, which is another burn barrier that we had. So here I'm showing you the before and after effect. And so this is a prairie that was burned. It's the prairie where you had to jump over the ditch. So you can see there's two different mounds, and in between there's a little tunnel. And so here's before, and you can see we used a burn barrier of just the mown grass. So here you can see the after, and it's all completely backened. You can also work with, because the complexity of this burn, we also had another field beside it. And because we didn't want that field to burn when we burned the more complex field, we burned that one first. And so this is an example of a different complexity. Here we have our barn. So we're burning fairly close to it and just using the mown barrier, but it becomes much more tricky when you're trying to get closer to the barn, because the wind actually shifts directions when you go around an object. So when you have a building or some sort of structure, the wind will go around the building, but then it will actually curve. It'll be a little bit of a suction behind the building as well, so you have to be really careful around buildings for that. So I can talk a little bit about the soils. The soils are important because the prairie species they're able to get their own nutrients, so they don't really need a lot of nutrient input. And what we have in North America is nitrogen deposition. So we have acid rain, and that's bringing down a lot of nitrogen into the soil, and it shifts the balance towards the non-native species, the cool season species that like a lot of nitrogen, whereas the prairie species can find their own, so they don't need that. So what the burn does is releases some of the nitrogen out of the soil, the ash and the other nutrients goes back into the soil, and that's fine. So the fire is actually very fast moving, so it doesn't actually damage the soil too much. It's just burning the top layer. And that allows for all the organisms that are living in the soil to reestablish themselves quickly. So tallgrass prairie is fire dependent, but if you're using a burn in a different area, such as in the Yucatán where we have tropical forest, those trees and the plants are not fire adapted, so you're killing the ecosystem, and that's not healthy for the system. You're returning the nutrients that are in the trees and into the soil, but because the way the system is in the tropics, all those nutrients quickly go out of the soil because of the heavy rain and all the microorganisms in the soil. They take them up, and quickly your soil becomes depleted. So in conclusion, just remember, you need to talk to your neighbors, talk to the fire department, create your burn plan, know all the emergency conditions that you need, find a friend that actually has done a burn, or hire a professional so that you actually know what you're doing, and they can help you, assist you in creating a proper burn plan and having all the proper precautions in place. You also have to have the right number of people. See, if you don't have enough people to manage the burn, if it gets out of control, then you run into trouble. You need to know all the conditions around the field. You need to think about it beforehand and plan it out really well. This isn't something that you can just jump into, but it is an important management consideration for prairie and for different grasslands. I also wanted to mention that after the burn, you need to go around and thoroughly walk the field and look for anything that's smoking. A lot of mice will create little grass nests in the soil, and those will smolder and burn for long periods of time. Some duff, like wood that's broken down, will smolder and burn in the soil for a long time. So you need to walk the whole field and check, make sure those are put out, make sure there's nothing near the edges, and make sure, and then you come back a couple times, make sure that the thing is fully put out before you walk away. The best time of year to burn is usually first thing in the spring, right after the snow melts, and there's a period of time when you're kind of waiting, and the non-native grasses, which are the cool season grasses, can start to come up just a little bit, and then the grasses are dry enough, but the soil is not too dry. It's still a little bit moist. That's the most ideal time to burn, because then the breeding birds haven't come back, and so you don't have to worry about things like that. And when you burn, the soil's still got some moisture in it, so the fire is not penetrating too deeply into the soil, and you're only burning the very top layer. We're just going out for a walk in the woods today, and we came across an area that was prairie last year, and they've done a prairie burn. And so you can see that the burn barrier they've used is this mown grass area. And then over on the other side, we'll take a quick look. This was only burned a few days ago, because the ash is still here. And here you see they've tilled an area along the side of the woods here. So they got woods all around, and so they want to protect that. We came across this. So this is how they're doing their prairie burn. So we have flares, and they've attached flares to the top of the stick, and they're using that to start the fire line. So that's not how I do it, of course. I have something called a drip torch, and it's a little more expensive, but you can also tie a propane torch onto here, and other people have used a propane torch tied on there. Also just using a rake. I had a modified rake. If you use a regular rake, you find that by the end of your burn that the stick is charred so much that your rake head might fall off. But I had modified the rake so that it had an extra piece of metal, so it was keeping out of the fire. And so you just grab a bunch of the dry grass material, and you just put it into your rake, and then you start it on fire, and slowly as you're dragging it along behind you, you can move the fire along. So you just start somewhere in the middle here, and because we're going east to west, they're probably starting on the far side because we have a westerly wind, and so they would start their back burn over there, and then slowly that would progress across the field, and then you start doing strips to cut it down into smaller burns at a time, and then eventually you'd get over to this side and you'll do your final burn, and it'll whip across the field. Although they probably didn't do too much of a heavy fast burn because we're in a wooded area and you don't want it to whip too far and too fast, and it's also a long thin field. So that's how they probably burn this field. But because the prairie burn is hot and fast, it burns off the top layer, and so it still has some organic matter down below. And some of the early spring species that are coming up here have been hit, and because the prairie species are warm season, they're not getting hit. They've got they're fire adapted and their rhizomes are below ground, and so that stimulates them to spread. And the non-native species, which are mostly cool season, the quackgrass and that sort of thing, they get burned because they come up green and come up fast in the spring. So it's a management option. And this will warm up much faster because the warm season grasses and prairie species like warm soil to come up faster. And because it's got a competitive advantage now, the field is clean, and the cool season species have all been knocked back. And so it shifts the balance towards the warm season species, the prairie species. So here you can see staghorn sumac, which is a species that invades tallgrass prairie. It's an early successional species, and if we didn't burn the prairie, you can see it's been knocked back, and the top growth will die, but it is also fire adapted, so it's going to come back again next year. But doing a regular burn, it'll help control it, so it won't be taking over the field. So I was just kind of giving you an overview of what we do for a fire, and you really do need to talk to the professionals if you're just starting out. So I'm just giving you the overview of what we do, and so you can do it in a safe way. I just want to invite everybody to leave messages if you're curious about different things. If you have different ideas of topics, you're welcome. You can subscribe to my channel and see the different videos that we're doing as they come up. So yeah, I just welcome you to be part of the journey.